My name is Heather Thompson. I'm the senior editor for Medical Design and Outsourcing. And joining me today is a terrific panel. Nancy Briefs is the CEO of Digital Cognition Technologies, Inc. Next to her is Venk Veeradan, the co-founder and CEO of Nano. After that is Jennifer Freed, co-founder and CEO of Explorer Surgical. And finally, last but definitely not least, Andy Fannell, who is the CEO of Kabara Medical. Thank you all for joining us today. So the first thing I'm going to do is have each of the panel members talk a little bit about their technology and what they're doing, because they're all in this forefront of digital health space. Nancy, we'll go ahead and start with you if you'll give me just a sec to queue up your slides.
Hello, is that working? Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today. For those that know me, I flunked the semi-retiring chapter last year and recently came back 2 months ago to be CEO of Digital Cognition Technologies. And I wanted to just give you a couple overviews of our exciting company. So go ahead. Terrific. So as many of you know, brain health, we believe, is really the next frontier in the medical field. A lot of the work that's been done historically in this area is around observation and subjective testing. So not only is there a lot to learn, but there's a great opportunity to bring data management, mobile solutions to the category. Today, there are 1.3 billion people around the world that are 50 years of age or older, and we believe it's really going to be a tsunami, the impending challenges with dementia in this population. So we've developed a digital platform around drawing behavior, and it's applicable to a number of neuro problems, including Parkinson's, MS, and dementia. Go ahead. The company is a spin out of MIT and Randy Davis's lab, where they've been working for the last 12 years in artificial intelligence, and the Leahy Medical Center, where we've been looking at dementia in patients for over a decade as well. So the company in-licensed from MIT proprietary IP, and we believe from doing a review, you can go ahead.
Is this the one you want?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right there, good. That it is the seminal intellectual property at looking at behaviors in the way that we draw. And that IP continues, as you heard in the earlier session today, to be mined for additional claims and strategies. The platform itself includes a digital pen that captures your drawing, an internet cloud solution running on the Amazon web server. We currently have 6,000 patients already on our platform. We take that information and we pull out 700 different variables using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and signal processing. And then we compare that against a consensus database of patients that have dementia. So we then pull out 22 key variables and provide a measure of brain health. Okay? And we have a very robust clinical set. For me, it's the first time I've been at an early stage company where the technology has already been validated and verified, so it's a pretty exciting time. The database, the patients have been given some of our tests since 2011 at the Leahy Clinic, which is a consensus diagnosis of dementia that we used as the data set for the patients that have cognitive impairment. And for the normative data set, we've been collecting patient data. All of the Framingham Heart Study patients have been getting the test, and we'll continue to get it for longitudinal data. Okay. So what we've done is we've applied our technology really to look at what can we do with machine learning and artificial intelligence to give insights into behavior. It's a growing market. As you probably know, you can't pick up anything in digital health these days without seeing a reference to machine learning. And we're very excited to be the pioneer in the brain health segment. So that's a little bit about our company. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. And then next we have Venk Veredan. Venk, I'm going to cue up the slides that you just gave me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Venk Veredan, co-founder and CEO of Nano. We're a connected self-technology platform for diagnostics and chronic disease management based on our proprietary invention and core DNA of what we call cloth-based nanosensors. I'm very excited to be here today. I think medical IoT is probably one of the most complex spaces to be a part of, but also the space that I think is probably going to be the most transformational in healthcare going forward. And real pleasure to be sharing the stage with Jen, Andy, and Nancy. Actually, Nancy was one of our earliest mentors when we got started 3 years ago in the space and has taught us a lot over the time. So it's been cool getting to know you. And obviously, Jen and I have gotten to know each other in an accelerator program over the summer. Nanoware, we are founded on the basis of the cloth-based sensors that I mentioned. And what we have targeted for our first vertical space in disease management is congestive heart failure. So we felt that this was the most unmet clinical need from a non-invasive monitoring standpoint that could identify decompensating heart failure weeks in advance of a hospitalizing event. And really curb those readmissions that is probably at the forefront of what Medicare is looking for with regards to outcomes-based and value-based solutions. So you've got the Bluetooth, for patients not familiar with it, but patients with CHF, the condition underlying their heart muscles inability to relax or weaken over time causes fluid buildup in the lungs. And once that happens, the patient obviously is unable to breathe and needs to be treated in the hospital over a period of 3 to 4 days. So we feel that we are able to detect this decompensation weeks in advance of symptoms using an undergarment that utilizes our cloth-based nanosensors. And we're capturing and algorithmically scoring 7 different metrics from this undergarment. Multi-channel EKG, heart rate variability, respiratory rate, cardiac output and stroke volume, thoracic impedance, cardiophenography, so the sounds of your heart, the S3, S4 murmurs, which CHF patients exhibit, as well as actigraphy. You may have seen remote monitoring products that are just looking at impedance measurements. We are taking 2 to 3 steps further with the sound and the respiratory signals. And it's communicating to a mobile application which draws the test every day, and then that is pushing the data to a HIPAA-compliant portal where server analytics are conducted, and a daily score is sent to the care management teams, basically a green light and red light score. If they're dropping below threshold into red light, the care management teams have well in advance time to change medications, diuretics, ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, and bring that patient back up to green light. We're not guessing on this thesis. Boston Scientific proved this with an implantable device in the multi-sense heart logic trials, looking at the same metrics. This is the next one. Oh, that's fine.
Sorry. Yeah.
No problem. But and we are replicating that study, moving into a 300-person clinical study next year, and the lead PI of that study is actually joining us and leading our study as well. So really excited to talk about the complexities of the space. As I mentioned in the promo, I think medical IoT is really one of those spaces where there's 7 different sort of companies that need to be built, and I think we can all provide some experience across that value chain to get the outcomes that we need in this space. Thanks.
And just to point out, there are a couple of slides. I'm sure Venk will show them to you if you... Sorry, it didn't work out. Jennifer?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Freed. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Explore Surgical. We are a software company that acts as a digital playbook for the OR. We work with both hospitals and medical device companies. And what's interesting is there's been so much interest around the data in what actually happens in the OR. Yet it's one of the largest black boxes that is still out there in medicine. There isn't a good structured way to really capture activity and see what's happening in the OR, who's doing what, when are they doing it, how are they doing that, and how does all of that come together and relate to hospital operations and financials and ultimately the clinical outcomes of what happens in that procedure. And so we built our company out of a research laboratory at University of Chicago Hospital because we saw that ORs were still running on paper and pencil. All of the activity and all of the data around what needed to be happening and when was living on little index cards or in random Excel spreadsheets. And so what we do is we'll build out workflows that are digital, where we say step by step what's happening in the OR. We'll break it out by role for a scrub nurse, for a surgeon, for an anesthesiologist, and then we make all of that available real time. So we can take tablets and wrap it in sterile sleeves. So you can either use this to track and manage the intraoperative analytics that you're already trying to track as a hospital, or as a device company, you can take those large binders of best practices that you're putting out there for devices and actually make it live and enable team members to capture that data real time.
Andy.
I'm Andy Fonnell. Work right now a startup called Kabara Medical in the electrophysiology space that's developing in terms of hardware implementation a new cardiac lead that leverages the epicardial space, pericardial space to access pretty much any part of the heart from the outside in a very compact manner. And the basis for that is really to establish not just a different improved way of doing cardiac rhythm management, but the basis for future neuromodulation. And that gets into leveraging and connecting to the autonomic nervous system for future, if you will, automated management of the heart and control. Past life worked at contract engineering and worked on a lot of systems and capital equipment and medical devices that involved connectivity, both in local wireless wired connections as well as to cloud, and managing all that from a product and software development perspective. It poses some unique challenges. And as I look ahead, both in electrophysiology space, where the data management is immense because the algorithms to provide sophisticated control and management of the heart and therapies, as well as for mobile and stationary capital equipment, is really putting a lot more demands, like we're talking about, a very complex area right now to manage and actually make a medical device that's predictive, when the basis for it is dealing with the unknowns and uncertainties ahead.
That's great. Thank you. You know, one of the things you said, Venk, when we were just starting to talk about this panel is that we are essentially in the 1970s of personal computing when it comes to getting into the medical technology field. So we know that machine learning has the power to change healthcare. We believe it. We want to get there. We're still at the point where the technology is on the table being adopted. So what are some of the big challenges that you've all faced as you're going through this process? Where did you see the biggest roadblocks?
Wow, I could
Too
talk.
big? Is that too big of a question?
It's a loaded question.
Let's back it up, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about verification and validation, and I'll actually start with Nancy on
Sure.
this. So the first question you're going to get when you're going to market is, how did you validate this? It's probably one of the biggest challenges. So when it's AI, you're dealing with an unknown. What do you do when you don't have data?
Well, I think it's a good question. My experience as a co-founder at Mpho Bionic, we were in the EP space, so we were very lucky because there were annotated databases that people had used and gone through FDA. So we could train our data set on a certain amount and then test, and we knew what the guidelines were. I think that's probably rare for a lot of companies and a lot of applications. At Digital Cognition Technologies, there were machine learning and signal processing, none of this had ever been applied to drawing behavior, over 12 years ago. So candidly, that's why they spent 10 years and a lot of research and pulling out, they had to create a normative data set. So that's why they started doing the Framingham heart study patients. And that was driven both by our founders at Leahy and MIT, but also a very prominent physician at BU, Rhoda, who started testing every single person that came through Framingham. So then we had the test, we had a consensus diagnosis that they were healthy, so we could use them in our database, and that became our normative healthy data set. At the same time, because a data set did not exist for Parkinson's, MS, dementia in general, we had to build that. So we licensed from Leahy Medical Center another 2,000 patients with a consensus diagnosis. So we knew exactly their situation. They also had our drawing test so that we knew and could use those to build the data set. And then we were able to run the validation verification on those. But it took a very long, you can imagine, it took a very long time. And then, as I said, they found 700 variables, and they had to tease out which ones were the most valuable clinically. And that was work that was done by Dr. Dana Pinney at Leahy, who is also a co-founder. So I think that can be a real challenge if you're going into really a white space, because you're going to have to do that yourself and figure out how to do that. And candidly, most startups don't have that kind of time or money. This was all done on research grants and National Science Foundation work, and we were able then to spin it out and take it. So we got lucky, because I'm not sure that any institutional investors I know would have funded us for 12 years to pull this together.
Yeah, I think Nancy touches on a good point about data collection, and most of us, and she touches upon the point that how many people are in medical IoT? So you guys will understand, and for those that aren't, the complexity of it really comes down to, especially if you're starting with a device, you've got your device sort of at your first step. You've got your hardware or sort of Bluetooth communication as your second step. How do you get the information off the device to travel to a phone or a HIPAA-compliant environment? Generally, we are using the phone, the mobile app, or a smart phone to draw data from that hardware module. So that's basically step 3. You've got a mobile application, UI, UX you have to design. That's step 4. Step 5 is pushing the data to a HIPAA-compliant portal. And then step 6 is compiling all of that data and doing the machine learning for the services that you want to provide to either a hospital or a care management team or what have you. So for a company like ours and a company like Jen's and Nancy's new company, there aren't a lot of data sets that are out there. And basically you have to do revolutions on all 6 of those steps over and over and over to build the data set to start showing trends analysis that can address the outcomes that you're trying to show. Machine learning, this whole idea, especially when you talk about it on the West Coast, it's viewed as this magical thing, this artificial intelligence that just sort of happens and a neural network gets smarter and smarter. It's really all a function of your data set. For the companies that are early stage that need to create that data set, it is difficult in the market, as Nancy mentioned, to convince institutional investors for the patients and the inventory build to collect all of that data. And each of those 6 value steps, as you can imagine, verification and validation all through that step before you even get to your data stage is incumbent upon the operator, showing traceability documentation, even when you're developing the mobile app and the HIPAA compliant push. Each line of code needs to be documented. How is someone's data being affected or at risk at this stage? And I think for first-time founders like myself and Jen and others was very trial by fire on going to the agencies like FDA and CMS and what have you, and really getting a good understanding of what they need to see, particularly with a brand new, never seen sort of cloth-based sensor that we had. So partnership has been very key for us. We were down in DC about 11 times before our 510K submission and eventual approval. But I think that goes back to the original point, Heather, about why I think this is still 1970s PC days. There's not really pattern recognition that's out there for what a lot of us are trying to do. And as you guys all know, being in healthcare is founded on pattern recognition. So I think it's changing, and I think it's going to get stronger with more companies that are out there. And I think more importantly, the constituencies, particularly in CHF with Medicare penalizing hospitals around reimbursement for readmissions, there's specific disease states where provider networks really have to look around the corner for an innovative, low-cost solution. And I think that's going to drive adoption and a little bit of a pull for some of these newer technologies. But the reason you haven't seen widespread adoption is that getting getting inventory, getting all these clearances, and then figuring out how you're going to get paid is, from CMS is still very early days and not a lot of pattern recognition. So.
I completely agree with everything that has already been said, and building upon it, like Vink said, there's so little data that's out there in some of these areas that you're trying to go into, and it's so critical that you're building out that data set and finding the right way to collect it, which is how we work with some of our startup device customers who are saying, we're trying to go out there and prove that this works better than the status quo, that this is different. And so you have to have the right data collection tools to be able to go out there and do it. And so it all comes down to the data. And it can be that first patient or that first animal, or even the data that just shows, hey, this is a problem, to go out there and go after it. And also, building off of what Nancy said, there isn't a lot of patience when it comes to institutional investors who want to fund multi-year trials, which is why government funds and research partners and industry partners are so critical to building out this innovation ecosystem when you're trying to get started. I think one of the things that's really exciting is how rapidly the space is changing. I might argue that we were up to the 1980s now or so instead of the 1970s. But an anecdote is we started our company about 4 years ago, and we were bringing iPads into the OR. And when we talked to some of our first hospitals, I had nurses that looked at me like I was crazy and said, "You want to bring an iPad in my operating room? There's no way. What's wrong with you?" And now what we're seeing is, well, we actually just bought a whole set of Androids. So is your software Android compatible as well? So we're seeing that really rapidly change. You're seeing the infrastructure start to develop to say we're collecting data from all of these new sources. We need to be able to capture it. We need to be able to store it in a HIPAA-compliant fashion. We need to have the resources available to analyze it. So I think it's a really exciting time. We're definitely behind, but we are catching up.
And the agencies are adapting as well. I mean, FDA just started the digital health group piloting with 9 companies. I think we're seeing movement, from DC and from the provider networks as well.
I was going to say, from looking at the data set, the first plenary session talked about the speed and trying to work faster, and the complexity is going faster than I think the speed is coming down. So data collection is one big area, but there's also access to that data that exists today from the payer side of it. They sit on a lot of data, and getting access to that has been nearly impossible, especially for device companies and the startup community. Even to the extent that some hospitals are developing, just like you're working on, their own software systems to be able to capture that data themselves, because they're just pass through for it. And they, looking back, realized they were actually sitting at the intersection of collecting, or where that data is generated. And that's the basis for informing a lot of therapies and new ideas as well. In terms of challenges, As you guys mentioned and talked about it, from a development perspective, that's the hardest part. Again, taking the perspective, we're all trying to move faster and get things done quicker. You have this challenge of generating the case studies or the data sets to evaluate and verify, validate, and that in itself is a big challenge. But then the hardware platforms and the software interoperability with that slows everything down. Nothing works together. I can't tell you how many Bluetooth modules still take forever to program and get to communicate. And they've been around forever. And by the way, what's the latest Bluetooth standards that are out there today, and what are they called today? So the consumer side is moving fast. They can, because if your app locks up and it doesn't pass the data, so be it. But when you're trying to connect everything from where the data is collected all the way to where it's analyzed, that data integrity, that's what medical is all about, is risk management. And that's what makes it so difficult and challenging, is managing the integrity of that data, and then putting the hooks in place so when the data chain does fall down, you know when it's happened and you can interact with it. So that's been a big challenge, I think, in general, is for the hardware developers, especially a complex capital equipment. They tend to be a little bit more isolated. You know, if you look at an MRI machine, they're not challenged so much with the dynamics of the hardware, but people working on patient interacting devices, or hospitals using their own computer systems and updating it. That's pretty challenging from a development perspective, because everything, once you have to figure it out, then you have to implement and validate it. And by the way, the people that are making these platforms, the software, the hardware side is I think the most painful, because the support that's in place to support all the development people keeps winding down. Go to your blog boards and message boards to help go find solutions. That's pretty cumbersome from a development perspective, trying to move quickly. And then the last point, I think, in terms of data integrity, and for the startup I'm working on too, that's the unique challenge, is how do you make durable patient interfaces? The sensor is still the originator of the data, and a wearable, on the outside of a body is always challenged with the fact that eventually you have to take the device off or replace it just because of the environment. And that's a challenge, is how do you keep something collecting data from the patient in a durable fashion? And then implant-wise, there's a lot of unique opportunities to make something less atraumatic, but that then poses how do you keep that data integrity from a collection perspective robust enough, or do you put that issue onto the device? And that's the beautiful part of where things are going, is that computational power is becoming more powerful. They can deal with these anomalies a lot better. Whereas in the old days, if the data wasn't in a very tight tolerance, things wouldn't work very well.
Andy, let's dig a little deeper before we move on. Let's dig a little deeper in data integrity, and in a hectic wireless hospital setting. What are the limits of that data transmission? How do you approach that question?
Yeah, looked at long ago, started, when you're looking at new medical devices, so go back a little bit further, when you have new therapy devices, you've got the disposable, and then you've got a capital equipment, usually. There's always the pure disposable, pure implant, but when you have a electromechanical system and disposable, the capital equipment is, as I've always said, is in nice terms, it's a hindrance to the adoption of new technology, because in order for a hospital to incorporate that, it has to kind of go through a unique purchasing program, all that stuff. So one thought was, well, why don't you enact like a pay-per-use model and kind of change the way it's incorporated? And so access to that equipment then opened up kind of new ideas around, well, I can then monitor the number of clicks on a durable component or something that has a finite life. But getting access to that equipment to be able to measure that opened up unique challenges, because wireless, the infrastructure exists, but when you're in the basement of the OR, there's usually not cellular connectivity. So then you have to get access to that piece of equipment through the hospital network. And you think your own company's IT department is difficult, start working with the hospitals. And so everything can be overcome, but making it in a way where it's plug and play, I think, is where the industry has to go to make it seamless. And now it's about how do you get access to the device with other people's networks, and making it, again, seamless and easy versus a cumbersome task, because you want new technology to be rolled out rapidly. And if each rollout is a huge, cumbersome effort, that's not a very embracing approach for new technologies to be adopted.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think data transmission is probably one of the most important things that you need to solve for, and you have to take into account lots of variables. I know Nancy has experience on this, and Andy clearly does. When you're in the hospital or you're in a conference like this where there's a lot of network traffic, transmission can be slowed down, and what this ultimately will result in many factors, but it will start consuming a lot of your battery, which is yet another thing on the hardware side that you have to focus on. And to Andy's point, debugging a lot of these hardware issues is much harder than debugging software issues when you're realizing that this is working in your lab or this is working in your space, but when you're in a high network traffic environment, like a hospital, you are running into issues where tests can be started and then they'll fail because the connection is broken. So we can't rely on one connection. I think Andy makes a great point. You have to really build multiple connections for fail-safe modes. You have to have local storage on your device, just so in case the digital transmission is sort of broken, that you're always backed up. This is not only just for FDA, but for the clinical use case. But I also think, one additional thing that now that, as Jen mentioned, we're sort of moving into the 1980s, we've learned from a lot of case studies of the companies that tried it in the past, some on the consumer side as well. There were some good lessons from the consumer wearables companies that we learned from as well. Bluetooth low energy, at least from our experience, isn't going to cut it in healthcare. That's only using 2 to 3 sort of kilobytes per second on a transfer rate. And if you think about the type and the amount of data we need to be transmitting, especially for a company like ours, which is transmitting 7 sort of different metrics, almost 300 megabytes of data per test, we really need to step that transfer rate up. So we went back to Bluetooth Classic, which brought its whole new set of issues with it. We had to get an MFI license from Apple, which is hard, and get different clearances with FDA because BLE is something that FDA has gotten familiar with. But we knew we had to step up our transfer rate to about 10x that so we could do a friendly sort of once a week battery charging, as well as sort of mitigate the fact that high network traffic would really just cancel out a 2 to 3 kilobyte data transfer on Bluetooth low energy. So it's a little bit of an oxymoron. You think you're saving power, but actually BLE, because it has to transfer more and more packets, is actually going to run battery out quicker. So again, all the hardware issues really need to be sort of figured out up front, and you don't really figure it out without tripping over a lot of bricks.
Anybody else on this topic? Okay.
And I'm sure that goes into supply chain, which I know we're going to be talking about at some point.
That's the next question is, one of the things we talked about is that even as you're developing devices for this new space, you are still faced by all of the challenges faced by every medical device developer. So what are some supply issues that some of the group have faced?
I think to follow up on what we just heard, the supply chain here is as important, if not more important, than traditional devices. Things as simple as the Bluetooth chip, or doing your own cellular, which we've done in a technology, which meant a very extensive negotiation with Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. And these companies are not used to talking to medtech companies. They're looking for hundreds of thousands of units, right? So all of that supply chain has to be considered. And it took a lot longer, I've found, in both companies than I would have thought, because you have to educate your supplier on why you're looking at certain quality requirements, why you can't just change a chip when they have a new chip that comes out, because it's already part of your filing. So we learned the hard way that the supply chain is really critical. And to get someone on your team early that's done a lot of that, it knows how to negotiate with those people, I would suggest is a very valuable hire.
And just a quick example to Nancy's point, we're developing cloth-based nanosensors. We're porting our lab scale supply chain over to a third-party supply chain. When we first got started, we just assumed that we would go to Sri Lanka or like India or China to keep those supply chain costs down. very quickly we learned from the market, device manufacturers, the large players, Venk, we're just not going to buy from you if you do that. You're not a trusted medical supplier yet. It doesn't matter if you use a 1345 certified company. Who's bearing the risk if there is faulty sensors or a recall? So, then we had to change up our whole supply chain strategy, find vendors that were stateside, that were trusted suppliers, all the way from sort of your mid-cap companies to your large companies like your 3Ms or Honeywells or W.L. Gores. And to Nancy's point, working with those companies, sizes of those companies, they're looking for lots of units. And you have to pilot to get to prove a lot of this initial verification and validation. And I think all of those supply chain issues need to be documented, and the quality checks that we have gotten cleared with FDA need to be ported over. These companies have never sort of seen the specificity of some of these quality management systems. And I think that presents a lot of challenges, because you can build a device, but if you can't build it at scale, you're kind of in trouble at that point.
And to follow on a comment that was made earlier, one of the biggest limitations today is battery life. Batteries are really limiting what we can do with the sensors because of how much we can store and forward. And I don't know about you guys, but we always end up with custom batteries. Yeah. And then you've got to get them somewhere in Asia, and they're on holiday or they're not running batteries at the same time. And then we found we have to check them 100% when they get to the US. So I think batteries for these kinds of technologies, once those issues are solved or improved, will make a real difference for companies so that we don't have to do custom batteries. Our current digital pen has a very custom battery that comes from China. We've had to order more inventory than we need because we're deployed right now in 22 countries around the globe, and we can't run out of batteries. So I know it sounds bizarre, but batteries can really make or break your company if you don't have access. So.
Jennifer, you're smiling and nodding. Do you have anything to?
I'm just so happy that we're a software company.
We're happy for her too.
I mean, how much time do you spend dealing with thinking about how your software is going to fit into other people's devices?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about on the supply chain side that's been so interesting is just overall, the cost of sensors has gone down dramatically. So when we've seen and lots of challenges around making sure that they're correct and they have the right battery life and a lot of nuances with that. But on the hospital side, one of the things we've seen change so much is RFID technology and the ability to have really low-cost sensors. If you look at companies like KitCheck, you can put an RFID tag on every single medication and be able to know what's being opened, when is it available, has it expired. So I think that is a really exciting aspect of some of the new hardware technology that's been out there.
So let's, we do have a little bit of time, but I want to make sure we leave room for questions. And the big topic that the other big topic that we had discussed earlier was looking into the regulatory plan. Jennifer, your product isn't FDA regulated, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the decision-making on the path that you chose, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. So there's been a lot of talk, and Venk and I have talked about this quite a bit in terms of all of the new digital FDA policies and programs that are starting out. It's something where, as a digital health company, you have to decide whether or not you fit into that classification and whether or not you want to follow that approach. Arguably, if you can get your product approved and reimbursed, then it's a much easier sell to get people to use your product if they're getting paid to use it, rather than just pure cost cutting. I actually was speaking with one of the digital health leads at the FDA at the AdvaMed conference last week, and was asking about our product for that reason, where we confirmed that no, it's not a fit, the workflow software is not going to be something that is regulated anytime in the near future. But I'll pass this question off to Venk, who can talk about his experience.
Jen is a lot smarter than the rest of us in building software and navigating the FDA sort of workflow management. For companies like us, for better or for worse, we strictly fall under Class 2 guidelines. We are capturing data off the body, we are transmitting it, and we are making some sort of recommendation which would fit us under an MLO code as far as the FDA is concerned, a diagnostic really. And I think that comes with sort of two different steps. When we say that we're FDA approved and a 510K, we basically just got our full stack, our device through mobile, through HIPAA compliant physician portal cleared, just provisioning the data. So really it's kind of a useless clearance if you don't add the services component on top of it, which is the algorithmic alert. So we had to break up our regulatory into two phases. We do think the hard part is completed because as Andy mentioned, the hardware really is what we think is the really difficult part to tackle, especially if you're using brand new sensor technology and a multi-vector, multi-parameter approach like we are. There's no predicate device for that. So our first 510K was, close to 2,500 pages. About 90% of that was just based on characterizing the cloth-based sensor technology. FDA had never seen that before. We had to come up with really novel protocols to characterize that and signal equivalency tests, biocompatibility, atomic force microscopy to characterize it down to the elemental level. And while that was very challenging, and each time we left DC, I had the worst headache in the world coming back up I-95, it actually turned out to be a boon in disguise once we got there, because some of these protocols we created on our own. We filed additional IP on that. To sort of be one of the trailblazers of sort of medical IoT, and we are the first medical grade sort of FDA approved cloth for remote monitoring. I think you have to get yourself comfortable with that based, in a very early understanding of what your product and your technology platform is doing. And then when you get comfortable with that, you're Class 2, and you got to figure out how to do it as quickly and capital efficiently as possible.
Go ahead.
So I've had experience now with 4 510Ks going through in digital health. And the first one that we did was very similar to what you did, Vink. It was the entire platform, the device, the transmission protocol, everything on the cloud, security, and then the reports themselves. Then we went back and got just the software and the analytics platform cleared so that if a device provided data at a certain protocol, it could go through the engine. And I think that was a real breakthrough and very helpful. My current company, we've had the good fortune to have our Class 2 device just downgraded in July to exempt. So part of the 21st Century Cures Act was to make things that did not have safety issues to be easier to get to market. So we're finishing a 510K, a traditional 510K, but then we have someone outside look at it and certify that it's complete, and then we don't have to wait for FDA clearance. So for us, it moved up one of our commercial applications by almost a year. So right now, we're really very pleased with FDA's actions. And as you heard from Vink, and you probably read in the news, they have a new software program that they're piloting with 9 companies. And once that gets cleared, once you're cleared for your software, then you can use different input devices, et cetera. So for our application and many of the ones on the horizon, I think that's going to be very helpful in time to market. So.
Thank you. And Venk, you did touch on this earlier, but let's talk really quickly about the pre-cert pilot program for digital products. I just want everybody to be aware. FDA last week announced the 9 companies that are going into this pilot program, although Jeff Shuren did say they will accept more companies into the project as they go forward. Let's talk about that and how FDA is trying to help IoT, deep learning, digital products get off the ground. Anybody? Nancy? Venk? Go ahead.
Yeah, just very briefly, from what we know of it, it is a mix of large cap and early stage companies with a heavy weighting to the large cap side. So I know J&J is a company. I think Verily is a company. And then there are some early stage companies, and I do think that that will grow. I would love to lobby FDA for Nanoware to be a part of that study as well, because Nancy was actually one of the few people in the beginning that sort of gave us that advice when we first got started. Do not try to clear a brand new device and the alert algorithm at the same time. It's going to be too big of a nut for the FDA to crack. So we broke ours up in the same way, where we're going to clear our software alert algorithm after our large clinical trial, because as I mentioned before, we need that data set. But with this new group, more than likely that second stage would go through this group as opposed to traditional CDRH. And given our timing of sort of doing our trial next year and the pilot program going on, we may still have to submit through CDRH, who was looking at alert algorithms before, if the pilot is not progressing. But we do think that it's going to be anywhere from 24 to 36 months for them to establish this protocol with the 9 companies. So again, very awesome that they're doing this. It's still going to take some time, but I think getting the constituency of software people that understand the needs for regulation. These were not healthcare people that with traditional healthcare backgrounds, but traditional tech and IT backgrounds. Getting them up to speed on all of the traceability, risk management, as Andy mentioned, is going to be critical in this pilot phase.
Go ahead.
Yes, I think it was really interesting too. There were 100 companies that applied to the pre-cert pilot, and of the 8, 2 of them were small companies. The rest were, very large companies: Fitbit, Roche, Samsung, Verily, and of course Apple as well.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about this, though, is very similar to what we're getting now that we're exempt, which is that you have to agree as part of this to allow the FDA to come do a deep dive on your quality system so that they can actually look at how you're developing and testing and maintaining your software products. And I think as this goes through and we're able to get these pre-certifications, then they'll be able, on their routine audits of your facilities, to know that you're following your quality processes. I think this should really help tremendously, and I think it's a great program for them to undertake. So I think it's very encouraging that digital health is going to see a much faster review cycle at the agency.
All right. Thank you all very much for coming. We'll see you in a few minutes.
Thank you.
And thank you to our panel. Appreciate it.